I'm Avery Dalton, 28. And the morning this began, I found a plain envelope on my porch with a photocopy of a title record inside. The owner's name half-blacked, as if someone wanted me to see just enough to panic. So I held the page up to the light and whispered that someone in my family had been lying for a very long time. Nolan asked over the phone why a document like this would show up at my door without a return address. And I told him the paper felt older than the house I lived in and that none of it made sense yet. I folded it twice, slid it into my jacket, and tried to ignore the way my hand shook when the wind caught the edge of the page like it recognized me before I recognized it. By noon, I was sitting at my kitchen table replaying the moment I lifted that envelope. And I kept hearing my own voice murmur that a secret this deliberate never arrives by accident. Reese texted that she needed to talk later. And the timing hit me hard enough that I muted the notification before her name finished flashing. I stared at the crooked grain in the tabletop I'd refinished last fall and felt the weight of that photocopy settle exactly where old truths usually do. Right behind the ribs, when Martin called to remind me of the family dinner he'd arranged for tonight. His words tightened the same spot the envelope had already bruised. And I told him I'd be there even though something in me had already braced for impact. Celeste chimed in from the background asking if I could come early. And the way her voice thinned on the last syllable matched the blurred name on that title record too perfectly to ignore. I hung up with the quiet certainty that whatever waited for me at their dining table had started the moment someone decided to slip that envelope beneath my door. By the time I walked into my parents' dining room that evening, the envelope in my jacket felt heavier than the silverware lined along the mahogany table. And Martin lifted his glass just slightly, as if the meal were a prelude to a verdict, telling us he had arranged something that would set the two of you on solid ground. Reese leaned forward with a bright grin when he slid a thick packet toward her, murmuring how excited she'd been to hear about a new start. And Celeste brushed crumbs from the tablecloth while urging her to open it. I watched Reese unfold a glossy lease for a Denver loft and lift a brass key like it had been waiting for her all her life. And the smile she threw across the table carried the same glow as the pendant lights she'd chosen for her showroom last spring. When Martin pushed a thin envelope toward me, he tapped the corner as though clarifying ownership, telling me it was a modest place outside Fort Collins and that someone with my hands-on strengths would make the most of it. And Reese let out a soft "oh" that landed between delight and pity. Celeste reached for my wrist with a practiced warmth, murmuring that not every opportunity arrives polished, while Reese traced the embossed lettering on her lease and mentioned how lucky we both were in our own ways. I slid the single rusted key from its paper sleeve and felt its uneven edges catch against my thumb. And the blurred name on the photocopied title record in my jacket pulsed in time with the silence I held to keep from reacting. Martin shifted in his chair and asked if I understood the gravity of being trusted with real property, telling me the place needed vision and that he knew I'd rise to it. And Reese laughed lightly about already planning furniture layouts for her loft. Celeste urged me to be grateful that I had something stable to build from, reminding me that not everyone gets a head start. And Reese added that at least I wouldn't be drowning in rent the way she used to. I folded the address, slipped between my fingers while the room settled into a gentle hum of approval. And the weight of the envelope I'd found that morning pressed harder against my ribs, as though confirming that what looked like generosity tonight had begun unraveling long before any of us sat down to eat. The gravel road turned into a narrow path framed by overgrown brush. And when the house came into view with its slanted porch and weathered siding, the rusted key in my palm felt like it already knew its place better than I did. So I whispered that maybe Martin hadn't bothered to look at the condition before declaring it a fresh start. Nolan called as I stepped over a fallen gutter, asking if I'd had time to study the photocopy again. And I told him the blurred name kept tugging at the edge of my thoughts like a thread someone was daring me to pull. I nudged the swollen door inward, and the stale air pushed against me with the dull insistence of a space that had been waiting too long for someone who wasn't coming. The kitchen floor dipped under my weight as if testing my resolve, and I murmured that the wiring dangling near the ceiling made even the silence feel unstable. while I traced the outlines of where cabinets once hung. Nolan asked if I wanted him to run a preliminary check on the title chain, and I told him he could, but that I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be hoping for anymore. I stepped into the living room and saw my breath cloud faintly in the air, and the echo off the bare walls folded around me like the room had never expected to hear a voice again. A gate creaked behind me, and Mabel Sinclair from next door leaned against the fence with an assessing glance that landed somewhere between sympathy and recognition, telling me this land once belonged to a woman who poured her life into it. I asked if she remembered the owner's name, and she nodded toward the gnarled cottonwood tree by the back lot, noting that some things refuse to disappear even when paperwork goes missing. I stood on the sagging porch with the rusted key catching the last edge of light, and the memory of the half-blacked title record in my jacket pressed against my ribs as if confirming that the truth under this structure was older and far less abandoned than the house itself. The first week blurred into a rhythm of tearing out warped floorboards and hauling debris across the yard, and I kept reminding myself that a structure this neglected only gives up its shape if you demand it 1 inch at a time. Nolan checked in between site visits, asking whether the temporary wiring felt safe enough for me to keep working alone. And I told him the circuits held for now, but the house breathed like it didn't fully trust the repairs yet. Each night I locked the door behind me and felt the rusted key turn with a resistance that matched the knots forming along my palms. By the second week, fresh drywall lifted the rooms out of their shadows, and I caught myself murmuring that maybe progress doesn't announce itself so much as accumulate quietly until you can't deny it anymore. A client picked up a reclaimed wood sconce I'd finished in my workshop and mentioned wanting a matching pair, and the brief warmth in her voice landed softly after days filled with the heavy scrape of sanders and crowbars. When I stepped back to view the new kitchen frame, the clean lines steadied me, and the air no longer carried the sour trace of insulation that had blown across the counters on my first day inside. Late one afternoon, while clearing the crawl space above what used to be the pantry, I nudged loose a tin box that clattered against the joist as if announcing itself too loudly for its size, and I whispered that no house keeps quiet when it's been holding something for years. Inside was a folded note on yellowed paper with the initials ER scripted along the edge, and the ink had bled just enough to show it had been handled more than once. I held it against the fading light seeping through the window cutout, and the shape of those letters tightened the space around me in a way that matched the half-blacked name on the title record tucked inside my jacket. 2 weeks into the renovation, I pulled up to the house with a load of lumber and found Martin's truck already in the driveway, and the sight of him wiping dust from his sleeves told me he'd let himself in long enough to form an opinion he intended to weaponize. So I asked whether something was wrong with Reese's new place. He brushed past the half-framed doorway and mentioned that Reese needed time to settle, adding that the loft wasn't the right fit after all, and that families step in when someone's overwhelmed, while Celeste stood behind him murmuring that transitions can be harder than they appear. I stared at the stripped-down studs behind them and felt the quiet thud in my chest when Martin added that I could start packing because 48 hours should be enough to vacate if I cared about keeping peace. I leaned against the counter I'd sanded smooth the night before and reminded them the key had been handed to me as a long-term commitment, and Reese's name drifted through the conversation like a reason neither of them bothered to question. Celeste reached for my arm with that soft, coaxing voice she used whenever Martin drew hard lines, whispering that Reese was frightened of losing momentum and that a supportive sister would understand how much this space could stabilize her. The plywood beneath my hand still held the faint scent of the sealant I'd applied, and the contrast between its fresh promise and their rehearsed urgency sharpened the moment into something I couldn't pretend to mishear. When they left, the screen door snapped shut with a finality that landed heavier than their words, and I stepped outside to shake off the echo, still clinging to the air around the porch. I pulled out my phone and told Nolan their visit hadn't been a courtesy but a demand, and the brittle edge in his voice tightened when he urged me not to sign anything and not to leave the property under any circumstances. I watched their truck vanish down the gravel road while the unfinished frame behind me held steady against the wind. And the certainty that had flickered since the night of the family dinner settled hard in my ribs. As plain and unignorable as the threatened deadline hanging over the address, I refused to surrender. I stopped by Reese's showroom to pick up a box of tools I'd lent her. And the moment I stepped inside, her voice drifted from the back office in a sharp whisper about an overdue balance that needed immediate payment, followed by a strained promise that the full $71,000 would clear once she secured family support. I froze beside a display table as the sound of her card being declined punched through the thin door. And the silence that followed landed with the weight of someone realizing the math would never work in her favor. When she emerged, smoothing her hair while pretending not to see the printed notice slipping from her clipboard, I greeted her with the same steady tone I used while carrying lumber, letting the moment pass without letting it disappear. She walked me toward the front with a brightness that didn't reach her eyes, mentioning how the loft had already become overwhelming and hinting that some places belong to the child who needs them most. As if speaking the line aloud might make it true, I nodded slowly while the edges of that overdue notice fluttered behind her, its red lettering confirming what her practiced smile tried to hide. By the time I reached the door with my tools tucked under my arm, the weight of her looming debt settled into place beside everything else Martin and Celeste had insisted was merely a matter of timing. And the echo of that declined payment followed me out into the parking lot like proof that their urgency had never been about the house at all. Nolan called early the next morning and asked if I was near my laptop. And when I opened the file he'd sent, the scanned title chain came into focus with a clarity that felt almost confrontational as he pointed out that the property had never been registered under Martin at any point in its record. I traced the signatures on the oldest deed, and he murmured that the trust designation didn't shift until much later, landing squarely in my name through a beneficiary clause that had been in place long before my parents staged their divide-and-conquer generosity. The cursor blinked beside the document number, while the truth settled in with the same weighted certainty as the rusted key I'd turned in the lock only hours earlier. He urged me to bring the photocopy from the envelope so he could cross-check it with the county filings. And I told him the blurred half-name now made sense because the initials matched the ones on the folded note I'd found above the pantry. Nolan went quiet for a breath before explaining that the only person with the legal authority to create that trust was Edith Rowan. And hearing my grandmother's name threaded through official records tightened something in me that hadn't moved in years. I scrolled through the chain again, and the margins held small annotations that didn't appear on any of the documents Martin had waved around during the dinner. I called Edith the moment the file closed on my screen, and her voice carried a steadiness that made the floor beneath me feel less uneven as she asked whether the land still had the cottonwood tree behind the fence line. When I told her it did, she drew in a breath and admitted she'd placed the property in a living trust for me. But someone in the family had ensured the paperwork never reached my hands. I stood in the middle of the half-finished kitchen, with the scent of raw lumber settling around me. And the convergence of her confession with Nolan's findings made the house feel suddenly less abandoned, as if it had simply been waiting for its rightful owner to finally step inside with the truth. The morning I walked into the title and county recorder office, the fluorescent lights seemed too bright for what we were about to drag into the open, and Nolan placed the compiled chain of documents on the counter with a quiet firmness, while Martin muttered that this entire appointment was unnecessary because families handle property internally. The clerk began printing the official records and mentioned that the trust on file had never been amended, prompting Martin to insist he'd managed the land for years and that any missing paperwork was simply a clerical oversight. I watched the clerk lay out the deeds in chronological order, and the gap where Martin's name should have appeared hit with the same finality as the rusted key turning in the lock on my first day in that house. Celeste folded her arms tightly when the clerk pointed to the beneficiary line naming me as the rightful owner, and she murmured that mistakes happen when files age and that intentions matter more than signatures. Nolan stepped closer as the clerk confirmed the trust had been validated twice by the county. And the seal on the final page reflected across the counter like it had been waiting for the right moment to be believed. Reese rushed in with her purse half open and whispered that this was spiraling and that the family's stability depended on keeping certain transitions smooth. Her eyes flicking between the deeds and the clerk's steady hands. Martin leaned toward the desk with a brittle confidence and insisted there had to be another version of the trust because he'd been told the land was his to manage. While the clerk explained calmly that forging or presenting a false deed constitutes a fraudulent title claim in Colorado. Reese's breath hitched as the clerk added that attempting to take possession without legal standing could trigger both civil and criminal review. And the room shifted when Edith stepped forward and told all of us that the land had always been meant for the granddaughter who knew how to build rather than consume. The clerk handed the stamped confirmation across the counter, and its weight settled into my palm with the same grounded certainty that had eluded me through every stage of this fight. Martin tried one last time to argue that a family shouldn't be undone by technicalities. But Edith touched the edge of the stamped page and murmured that nothing here was a technicality, because every signature belonged to the truth they'd buried. Reese lowered her gaze as if the numbers she owed had followed her into the room. And Celeste whispered something about intentions never lining up with outcomes when fear gets in the way. I stepped back from the counter and told them I only wanted everything restored to what it was always meant to be. And the silence that met those words felt like the first moment any of us had stopped pretending this land belonged to someone else. In the days after the recorder's ruling, word spread faster than any of us anticipated, and former colleagues began calling Martin to ask why a fraudulent title claim had shown up under his name while he kept insisting the county had misunderstood him. Celeste stopped returning messages altogether, her silence tightening each time neighbors mentioned the hearing. And Reese avoided every group chat by muttering that she needed space to regroup. I moved through each update with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. The stamped confirmation tucked in my desk drawer as the only anchor I needed. A week later, a creditor tracked Reese to the showroom and demanded immediate resolution. And her shaky whisper about timing falling apart drifted through the partially open door like the collapse she'd been trying to outrun. Celeste left a voicemail about wanting to visit but not knowing how to face the tension in the air. And Martin asked if boundaries could be revisited now that emotions had cooled. I stood on my porch that evening watching the light hit the new window frame. And the quiet around the house settled with the certainty that the consequences had finally found the people who spent so long pretending they were immune to them. By early spring, the renovation had crossed a threshold where the house no longer felt like a reclamation project, but something quietly choosing to stand with me. And I caught myself tracing the new window frame while murmuring that it finally breathed the way a home should. A director from a Denver art center stopped by to pick up a lighting prototype and mentioned wanting a full installation built around the same warm geometry. And the invitation landed with a steadying grace after months defined by confrontation. That evening, I watched the soft glow from the fixtures I'd mounted arc across the living room, their gentle spill settling into corners that had once held only dust and silence. The next morning, Mabel brought over a faded photograph she'd found in an old box, pointing to Edith kneeling beside the young cottonwood that now towered over the fence line. And the image carried a quiet continuity that threaded my present back to the trust she'd safeguarded for me. I told her the land felt different now that the truth lived above ground, and she nodded toward the porch with a knowing lift of her brow that made the air between us feel lighter. When she left, the scent of early pine drifted across the yard, weaving through the spaces I'd rebuilt with my own hands. A few days later, Reese arrived with a small cardboard box and whispered that she wanted to return what belonged to me, placing my childhood compass inside my palm before stepping back with a heaviness that looked like acceptance rather than apology. I held the compass long after her car pulled away, its worn brass warm against my skin in a way that steadied more than it stirred. As the sun dipped behind the cottonwood, the house exhaled into the quiet. And for the first time in years, The stillness didn't feel like something to brace against, but something to rest inside. As the last light settled across the house, I felt a quiet gratitude for everyone who stayed with me through this story and whispered that your presence here matters more than you know. If any part of this journey echoed something in your own life, I hope you found a moment of peace in it. Share the video if it touched you. And subscribe so we can keep walking these stories together.